Good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank everybody who's here. I want to especially thank Miriam Thompson for inviting me, actually, this past summer to come to here before you in this most important Connecting the Dots and Let's See Where We Go From Here panel discussion. So, there has been a number of points in my life where I became active in the movement for Palestinian self-determination. One was in the late 70s, early 80s, when I was very much involved in supporting national liberation struggles in Latin America, Central America in particular, obviously South Africa, not just South Africa, but also Mozambique, Southwest Africa, which became Namibia, and also Palestine. And back then, the rallying call of Palestinian self-determination was that the PLO was the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. And this is at a time when internationalism was framed around secular nationalism. That obviously has changed, but that was one of the points that influenced me. Another one was around the year 2000, the outbreak of the Second Intifada and the failure of Oslo. And here we see a new dynamic happening in Palestine. So this got me re-involved in the struggle. And it was shortly after that, I would say around just after 2006, when the massive mobilizations for immigrant rights happened throughout this country, that I started to notice that mainstream Jewish organizations, such as the JCRC, the ADL, were inviting leaders of the Latino community and the immigrants' rights movement to Israel on all these expenses-paid trips to Israel. Obviously, they did not go to the Gaza Strip or the West Bank. They went to, Haifa, Tel Aviv, and the beaches and all these touristy places to show how nicely we treat our Jewish immigrants to Israel. How ironic, right? So, so this started making me think, how do you counteract such subversion within the immigrant rights movement? How can we counter a narrative? And how can an organization that is not well-funded and well-politically connected as the pro-Israeli Zionist organizations, how do we go about doing that? So I went back to my organizing roots. The best way is to go where the people are, using your own history, your own collective experiences to explain what's going on in Israel and Palestine. So I helped organize a delegation of people of color to Palestine in 2008. And as was said before, we had Native Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans, and Latinos. And it was fully paid by a subset of the American Friends Service Committee, the Third World Coalition. And as soon as I came back, I prepared this very short PowerPoint, and it's dated June 2008 when we got back. So it's basically a structural analysis of comparing Palestine to what happened in Mexico historically. It's not quote-unquote historiography. I did not interview primary sources, so any historians in the audience, please do not jump on me afterwards. But if we go to the next slide. Okay, so basically, separated, continents apart, separated by oceans and distinct cultural development, Mexico and Palestine have a history of colonization, settlement aggression, land seizures, ethnic cleansing, and racist oppression. This presentation will seek to go beyond the superficial similarities between Palestine and Mexico and uncover structural patterns of oppression that are common in every struggle for self-determination and national liberation movement against colonization and occupation, similar to what Youssef said when he was talking about a general trajectory of colonization. The Third World Coalition of the AFSC hopes to open new avenues of international solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for self-determination, and in doing so, we ourselves get liberated. Next slide, please. So just really brief overview of Mexican and Palestinian history. In Mexico, the Spaniards invade the New World, and in the 1500s, it's shortly followed by other European empires. Afterwards, Mexico becomes a possession of the Spanish crown. Indeed, most of Latin America does. In Palestine, after various Eurasian empires ruled the Middle East, Palestine is ruled by the Ottoman Empire for centuries. Palestine becomes a British mandate after World War I, as was explained before. Next slide. In 1821, Mexico gains independence from Spain. However, in the 1830s, US slave states, expansionists, that means those who wanted to expand slave states throughout the United States, begin to settle in the Mexican state of Texas. Texas at the time was part of Mexico. And these settlers start a campaign of ethnic cleansing. In Palestine in the late 1800s, the European Zionist movement plans to colonize Palestine. There were other places they were thinking of making the state of Israel. I think Uganda was one, and I think part of Argentina was another. And then the Zionist violence terrorized Christian and Muslim Palestinians in the early 1900s, and also a campaign of ethnic cleansing ensues in Palestine. Now, if we go to the next slide. Okay, so in Mexico, the independent Republic of Texas is annexed by the United States. Now, this becomes a pretext for further aggression against Mexico. Provoked by settler aggression, Mexico declares war on the United States in 1846, and then the US invades Mexico. In Palestine in 1947, the UN partition plan is approved with support of Western powers. Arab nations are not consulted and reject the partition, and especially the Palestinians are nowhere in the equation as to determining their future. Under the UN plan, 55% of historical Palestine is apportioned to a Jewish state. Next slide, please. So the Treaty of Guadalupe and Hidalgo and the Nakba, I compare the two because in the Treaty of Guadalupe and Hidalgo, very uncanny, 1848, Mexico loses 50% of its national territory to the United States. Newly acquired territories include the current states of Texas, Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and California. In the Nakba, in 1948, Palestine loses 78% of its land to the Jewish state, and 750,000 Palestinians are dispossessed of their homes and land. 1,000 becomes internal refugees in their own land. Others flee to neighboring countries, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt. Well, this is Mexico. Way back when, this is what Mexico used to look like. Next slide. Another one. Yeah. That's what Palestine used to look like. Next slide. I'm going to go over these very quickly. I'm not going to explain to you what they are because you already know. Next slide, please. Okay. So then this is when the so-called independent state of Texas gets annexed to the United States. So this is still Mexico, and as you can see, the Southwest and all of California is still part of Mexico. Next. And that's the partition plan. Next slide. That is Mexico now losing most of the Southwest. Next slide. The 1967 occupation. Next slide. Current map of Mexico as it is. Once after 67, the rest of Palestine is occupied. Next slide. So I think it's also important to look at the ideologies that made this history possible. This didn't happen out of a vacuum. Manifest destiny was the ideology that propelled colonists from the east of the United States to go into the Southwest. Zionism was the same ideology that propelled the European Zionist movement to colonize Palestine. So the things that they have in similarity, now I'm thinking of broad general terms, they were both expansionist. Manifest destiny was had the racist notion that it was civilizing the West. It presumed racial superiority of white people over Native Americans and Mexicans. This ideology justified ethnic cleansing. Zionism, also expansionist, a racist notion of a land without a people for a people without a land. I say that racist because it was well known to the early Zionists that there were people there, that there were Arabs there, there were Muslims and Christian Palestinians already at that land, but they felt it was for their purposes to say there were no people there. It presumes racial superiority over Jews over Palestinians and other Arabs, and I think we can now extend that to the African refugees who are in Israel now and all that vicious racism that you hear from the media in Israel. And it also justifies ethnic cleansing. So then I compare the two walls itself, the one in the West Bank and the one on the US-Mexico border. In 2006, the US Congress passed the Secure Fence Act, which will expand the wall between Mexico and the United States by 700 miles. Colesman Inc. of New Hampshire, which is a wholly owned US subsidiary of Elbit Systems of Haifa, Israel, builds the high-tech portions of the wall between the US and Mexico. And remember, this was done this slide was done in 2008. Elbit Systems just got a contract renewed by Department of Homeland Security to do the same. So in the West Bank, in Palestine, in 2005, the Israeli Knesset approves a plan to build an apartheid wall well within the West Bank. The Elbit Systems of Haifa is the largest private military contractor in Israel, is the principal contractor building this apartheid wall in the West Bank. That's the map of the proposed wall back in 2008. We did not go into that. But in our discussions in Palestine, we talked about we learned that the apartheid structure of cantons and Bantustans are being applied to the West Bank. We discussed Israel's political and economic military relations with apartheid South Africa and the right-wing military dictatorships of Central America in the 1980s. We discussed the impunity US police have in killing of people of color, incarceration rates, and military-style immigration and customs enforcement raids in the United States. We also talked to our Palestinian brothers and sisters, and we learned that the idea of transfer, forceful removal of Palestinians from their lands to other Arab nations is common political discourse among Israeli Jews. We learned that the idea of security and terrorism justifies checkpoints, arbitrary arrests, detentions, and border militarization. We learned together that we have one struggle. Next slide, please. Okay, so we witnessed the everyday resistance to occupation in the West Bank and racist discrimination in Israel. That means Palestinian citizens of Israel also get discriminated by laws and other structures within Israel. We found that there is hope in local organizing efforts in small villages and by community organizations in the city. We looked into a mirror, and at times we saw the present, the past, and the future. What do I mean by that? Each night we used to go back to our hotel or wherever we were staying and try to debrief and try to deconstruct and try to understand what we actually went through. And one of the most profound comments was made by one of our youngest Chicanos on the delegation, and he said, you know, I don't know if I'm looking at the past, present, or the future. The past meaning, I think this is what Mexico went through. The present, because I live in San Diego, and there are checkpoints, there are walls, and the police will ask you for your IDs, as they did to us while we were in Israel and the West Bank. And are we looking at the future? Is this the future of the security state, whether it's in the United States or in Israel or in European, so-called European democracies? So that we need to bring out. We also had a moral and political responsibility to end the racist Zionist occupation and genocidal siege of Gaza. Operation Cast Lead was underway as we were leaving Palestine. So we're going to end this here, and I just want to say within the few seconds that I'm over, that Youssef talked about a couple of things about a colonial trajectory, demographic engineering. That can be applied today with the detentions and deportations of immigrant communities that we have in this country. Every day, There are 34,000 people in detention by a mandate that you must keep 34,000 people, immigrants, in detention centers every day. And of course, we're well over 2 million deportations of immigrants from the United States. There was also emergency regulations were discussed in the early days of the Zionist experiment. We can say the same about the U.S. Patriot Act because within the U.S. Patriot Act, it allows the Department of Homeland Security to null and void any law within 100 miles of any border. 100 miles of any border is where 80% of all the U.S. population lives. Now that means the coast, that means the border with Canada also. It was also talked about demographic spillover as being part of the political discourse in Israel. Well, this is the same thing as United States anti-immigrants talking about anchor babies and talking about getting rid of birthright citizenship to those born of undocumented parents in the United States. So there's a lot of rich discourse, a lot of rich cross-pollination of our movements. I'm well over time, and I hope to entertain your questions afterwards. Thank you.
I've got a few different greetings for everybody in the audience. I'd like to say assalamu alaikum, shalom, buenas tardes, and I'll use a greeting from the Black Liberation Movement, which is particularly relevant for our discussion today, and that is free the land. Free the land, free the land. Necessary. I'd like to thank Miriam for putting this together, along with the members of AIM, for putting so much work and time into it. In early June, when she asked me, I explained to her that I didn't do Palestine solidarity work on a regular basis. But like everybody else, I would respond to the atrocities that would come up in 2008, 2012, and so on. But as Miriam can do, for those of you who know her, she convinced me to speak. And 3 weeks later, okay, in July, we have the assault on Gaza again. And so it is. I'd like to thank also Darrell Jordan, who was a former colleague of Gabe's, and Bill Fletcher, my friend who was a solidarity activist, who reminded us that it's not sufficient to say that the Gaza is an open-air prison, but to say that all of the occupied territories are a prison. And so we move from that position. I want to call my remarks born Black, born a Palestinian. And it takes on this title from a book of poems by the Palestinian-American poet Sahir Hamad, who some of you may know. And it acknowledges her growing up in the hip-hop and Black community in Brooklyn. And she takes these lines from a poem by the poetic giant and Palestinian solidarity activist, the late June Jordan, where she says, I was born a Black woman, and now I've become a Palestinian. In coming to consciousness on the plight of Palestinians, I didn't have any aha moments or some great epiphany. The organizations and individuals in the Black Power movement had come to a position on Palestinian liberation, and so I learned about these struggles for Palestinian freedom and self-determination in that context. And it was the context of a connection to other liberation struggles that Gabe mentioned on the African continent, Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, or South Africa. And I remember finally reading a copy of what was a standard text for the movement at that time, Our Roots Are Still Alive, the story of the Palestinian people. I don't know if any of you old-timers remember this, but this was a standard text for us, published in 1977 by People's Press. The solidarity movements were in the streets, they were on the campuses and universities, bringing together activists from all the movements. And that was my experience in New York, but also coming to North Carolina. At Shaw University, there were brilliant and militant students and faculty members who brought us into the movement, who taught us what was going on there, and we shared our experiences about liberation in this country. There's a long history of Black and Palestinian relations, And that is to say, the question of Zionism in Israel has been addressed by the Black movement in various ways from the early 20th century. And frankly, it's not always been good. In fact, sometimes it's been heartbreaking and even opportunist. There are many of these relationships, and I can't get into all of them now, but I will just say mention a few. For example, the great W.B. Du Bois, the brilliant African-American scholar and radical, didn't oppose Zionism. He understood it as an anti-colonial project, believe it or not. And he held this position while he was at the NAACP and even at the end of his life when he enrolled in the Communist Party of the US. But he was wrong. But he was not alone. The same Communist Party that had been so good on so many other issues of the so-called Negro question welcomed the formation of the State of Israel solely based on the horrors of the Holocaust. The Soviet Union at that time saw this move as a hedge against British imperialism that held the mandate in the territory that we talked about earlier. But they were wrong. And then there was Ralph Bunche, a hero to many African Americans because of his status as a first, much like the current Black figure who I will return to later. He was instrumental in the formation of the UN. He received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1950 for his role as the chief negotiator with the Zionists. As such, he played a significant role in the formation of the state that was founded on the violent displacement of the Palestinian people and has evolved into a settler colony that has perfected the apartheid state. African-American pride, among other factors, saw his role as honorable and noble, but he was wrong. Malcolm X is the next significant figure I want to highlight. And in some ways, his Black nationalist perspective about what had happened to the Jews in Germany was seen as a cautionary tale for African Americans here in our struggle. And he saw that the project to build a nation maybe had some lessons for national building in the African American community. But it was countered by his understanding of the plight of the Palestinian people, which he sharpened even more during his travels to Africa and the Middle East. And there's this famous article that he wrote for the Egyptian Gazette in 1964 called Zionist Logic. And in it, Malcolm X says, in short, the Zionist argument to justify Israel's present occupation of Arab Palestine has no intelligent or legal basis in history. He visited the occupied territories, he met with Nasser, he was in conversation with liberation forces. There's a new book out called The Diaries of Malcolm X, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz in 1964, that's edited by his daughter and the historian Herb Boyd. And it's likely to reveal some of these conversations that he had with these forces that brought him to that point. So there's Malcolm X. And then for many, there's the engagement of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee under the leadership of Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely Carmichael, James Foreman, and the little-known Ethel Minor, who had worked with Malcolm X in the past. And they issued an internal document around the question of the Israeli-Palestine conflict around the 1967 war. But it was leaked. And it became known as their position, and SNCC didn't back off of that position. They upheld it, and they paid dearly for it. The position condemned the Zionist state. It was not a clear ideological paper. It had a lot of clumsy and problematic formations, but it was their position. And it cost them dearly. They were in a Black Power period at that time and had lost a lot of support anyway, but this sort of like was the end of any financial and liberal support to the Student Nonviolent Organizing Committee. Kwame went on to be one of the biggest and dearest organizers for Palestinian liberation amongst the Black liberation movement and amongst the Pan-African movement. And I would suggest that you read James Foreman's book, Making of a Black Revolutionary, to take a look at this process. And then there's Dr. King, who was a good friend of Kwame's. The Zionists like to quote him about support for their project, and to say that if you criticize Zionism, you're criticizing Jews and that you're anti-Semitic, but there's no way to prove, there's no document that showed that he ever said that. The scholars and the activists are unable to verify that. But in any case, Dr. King tried to avoid any open conflict with Kwame on this. And he pushed on his anti-Vietnam project as Kwame pushed on his anti-Zionist project. And during that time, the contours of black respectability brought great criticism for both of them. But Dr. King was wrong. And so I want to bring us to where we are today in terms of delegations. Gabe mentioned a delegation of people of color in 2008, but there have been many others. In fact, as we speak here today, there's a delegation of African Americans, or two, somebody is telling me, one that I know of that's sponsored by the Interfaith Peace Brigades, and they arrived, I guess, in Tel Aviv today. But there have been three others. There's a constant flow of African American activists who want to see for themselves what's going on, and they come back with good information. And in those delegations, we go as internationalists. We're internationalists, but we also see things through the prism of our experience as African descendants. So we want to know about black Palestinians, right? In Israel, we want to know about the Ethiopian Jews. We also want to know about the black Hebrews who migrated from Chicago and New York to Israel. And what kind of treatment do they go through? What has been visited on them? And the reality is that as they reside in Israel, they end up becoming conscripted into the Israeli Defense Force and have to be a part of the implementation of these violent methods against the Palestinian peoples and the Palestinian resistance. But we know that there are other things that we see from delegations, and I'd just like to take, I've got a little time left, I've got a video I want you to see. It may not be something you're used to, but it's from a delegation that consisted of some culture workers, and it addresses the population in our community in this country that's going to make this thing happen.
Hard times, tales from the dark side, evidence of the settlements on my hard drive. Man, I swear my heart died at the end of that car ride. When I saw that checkpoint, welcome to apartheid. Soldiers wear military green at the checkpoint. Automatic guns, that's machine at the checkpoint. Tables not M16s at the checkpoint. Fingers on the trigger, you'll get leaned at the checkpoint. Little children grown adults and teens at the checkpoint. All your papers better be clean at the checkpoint. Gotta put your finger on the screen at the checkpoint and pray that red light turns green at the checkpoint. And Martin Luther King had a dream of the checkpoint. He waked with loud screams from the scenes at the checkpoint. As Malcolm X by any means at the checkpoint. Imagine if your daily routine was the checkpoint.
And Martin Luther King had a dream of the checkpoint. He waked with loud screams from the scenes at the checkpoint. As Malcolm X by any means at the checkpoint. Imagine if your daily routine was the checkpoint.
Separation walls that surround in the checkpoint. On top is barbed wire like a crown on the checkpoint. Better have your permits if you found at the checkpoint. Gumming on the tower, aiming down at the checkpoint. Idea is to keep you in fear at the checkpoint. Enter through the cage in the rear of the checkpoint. Feels like prison on a tier at the checkpoint. I'd rather be anywhere but here at this checkpoint. Nelson Mandela wasn't blind to the checkpoint. He stood for free Palestine at a checkpoint. Support BDS, don't give a dime to the checkpoint. This is international crime at the checkpoint. Arabs get treated like dogs at the checkpoint. Cause discrimination is the law at the checkpoint. Criminalized without a cause at the checkpoint. I'm just telling you what I saw at the checkpoint. Soldiers got bad attitudes at the checkpoint. Condescending and real rude at the checkpoint. Don't look them in their eyes when they move at the checkpoint. They might strip a man or woman nude at the checkpoint. Soldiers might blow you out the shoes at the checkpoint. Gas you up and in like the fuse at the checkpoint. Every day you stand to be accused at the checkpoint. Each time your life you can lose at the checkpoint. And Martin Luther King had a dream of the checkpoint. He waked with loud screams from the scenes at the checkpoint. As Malcolm X by any means at the checkpoint. Imagine Imagine if your daily routine was the checkpoint.
If Martin Luther King had a dream with a checkpoint, he went without screams from the scenes at the checkpoint. Is Malcolm X by any means at the checkpoint? Imagine if your daily routine was the checkpoint.
At the airport in Tel Aviv is the checkpoint. They pulled over our taxi at the checkpoint. Passport, visa, ID at the checkpoint. Soldiers going all through my things at the checkpoint. I was high risk security at the checkpoint. Cause of the oppression I see at the checkpoint. Occupation in the 3rd degree at the checkpoint.
The checkpoint. Now, you may know about all of those things that you saw, but that's a story being told in the voice of the young people that needs to be out there. And it's real important. It was part of this delegation that Bill Fletcher led. It included Dream Hampton, who's a filmmaker, and Reverend Graylin Hagler from D.C., who's running for city council in D.C. So these are the people that are going. I'm running out of time, and during the question and answers, I've got some thoughts about what we might do here in the Triangle area. But I just want to say, I think we've got at least 3, maybe 4 challenges in the Black community in terms of dealing with this. And one is Christian Zionism, okay? All of these tours, Gabe talked about the tours, right? All of these tours to Israel that are paid for and the churches are going there, is something we've got to deal with in a big way. And there's some ministers who see through it all, but we've got to work with them to get to some of the other congregations. There's also the question of our Black president, who again, like Ralph Bunche, okay, is seen with great esteem, and people are afraid to criticize him, and yet he's responsible for this horrible foreign policy on this question, and we've got to find a way to get around it. Now, of course, time is going to change that anyway, right? But still, we've got to step forward, because even in our community, we've got so many apologists, right? AIPAC and these other organizations are putting thousands and thousands of dollars into the hands of folks at HBCUs, not just on these campuses, but at HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, to win them over to this point of view that there needs to be this defense of Israel. So I'm going to end at this point, and it was said before about these connections with Ferguson, and they're really important. I'm not going to repeat them all, but in my thinking, it's like hands up, don't shoot in Ferguson, hands up, don't shoot in Palestine, right? It's also free political prisoners in Palestine, free political prisoners and prisoners of war in the US. It's stop the war on Black America, end the occupation, self-determination for African Americans and Palestinians.